At dawn on October 23, 1944, the Philippine Sea still smelled of oil and smoke from the great carrier duels fought only weeks earlier. But on the island of Leyte, the ground trembled with a different kind of thunder. American Sherman tanks rolled forward, their engines snarling in unison, steel tracks grinding against the wet volcanic soil. Japanese officers watching from concealed positions stared in disbelief. It was not the presence of tanks that unnerved them. They had fought armored vehicles before. It was the number. Convoys of olive-green machines, endless lines stretching from the beaches inland, as if the very earth was giving birth to steel monsters. The officers muttered among themselves. How could the Americans possibly replace what had been lost at Saipan, Guam, and Peleliu so quickly? Imperial Japanese Army Diary, Oct. 1944. By the third week of October, Japanese commanders knew their defenses were crumbling. The Americans had stormed ashore with more men, more supplies, more aircraft. But what unsettled the Japanese most was the sheer resilience of U.S. armor. A tank destroyed one day seemed to reappear in a convoy the next. Burned hulks from one battle were followed by fresh Shermans landing by sea in endless supply. It seemed impossible. For the Japanese, whose entire armored force in the Philippines numbered scarcely 200 tanks, many of them outdated Type 95 Hago light models, the scale of American reinforcement was unthinkable. U.S. Army After-Action Report, October 1944. The truth was not yet understood in Tokyo. The Americans possessed a weapon more powerful than any cannon or torpedo, industry itself. In Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland, factories were not merely producing tanks. They were producing victory. In less time than it took Japanese workshops to handcraft a single armored vehicle, American assembly lines could churn out dozens. While Japanese commanders clung to the hope that superior spirit and sacrifice could offset material disparity, the battlefield revealed the opposite. Spirit alone could not stop the tide of machinery that kept coming, battle after battle, wave after wave. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The setting of late 1944 tells the story clearly. The Pacific War had turned decisively against Japan. The loss of Saipan in July had opened the Marianas, putting B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. Guam and Tinian followed. The Japanese Imperial Navy had gambled everything at the Battle of the Philippine Sea and lost over 400 carrier aircraft in what U.S. pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. U.S. Navy Combat Air Report, June 1944. Without air cover, Japan's armies now faced the crushing reality of America's industrial war machine. Consider the numbers. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 17,500 medium tanks, primarily the M4 Sherman. Japan, during the entire war, produced fewer than 2,500 tanks of all models combined. Most were light tanks, thinly armored, designed for campaigns in China and jungle skirmishes, not for dueling American Shermans supported by artillery and naval gunfire. U.S. War Production Board, 1945. To commanders raised in a culture of spiritual superiority, these figures were incomprehensible. How could a nation across the ocean outbuild them 10-1? The doctrine mismatch made the disparity even more severe. Japanese doctrine emphasized the infantry as the decisive arm. Tanks were considered support weapons, auxiliaries to spearhead infantry assaults. In contrast, American doctrine had evolved into combined arms warfare, where armor, artillery, infantry, and air power moved in synchronized blows. To fight Shermans supported by P-47 Thunderbolts overhead and naval destroyers shelling from offshore was to face a storm from all directions. Field Manual FM 17-10, 1942. On Leyte, this storm hit in full. U.S. Sixth Army under General Walter Kruger landed with over 200,000 men, supported by 700 ships. Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, transferred from Manchuria only months before, could muster barely a third of that number. His armored battalions fielding the Type 95 and the heavier but still outclassed Type 97 Chiha faced a nightmare. The Chiha's 57-meter gun could rarely penetrate the Sherman's armor except at point-blank range. Meanwhile, Shermans armed with 75mm and newer 76mm guns could destroy Japanese tanks at distances over 1,000 yards. Technical Intelligence Bulletin 1945. Reports from Japanese tank crews reveal their despair. Our shells bounce off. The enemy's shells tear through us like paper, wrote one lieutenant in a diary later recovered near Ormoc. "We strike, but they come back stronger. We burn, but more arrive." Bundesarchiv translated War Diary Fragment 1944. What Japanese observers did not yet fully grasp was the invisible network behind every Sherman rolling ashore. In the heartland of America, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, managed by Chrysler, operated around the clock. Workers, men deferred from service, women recruited from farms and offices, labored in 3 shifts, welding, riveting, painting. What had once taken months now took days. Tanks rolled off lines like automobiles once had, a process alien to Japan's more artisanal system. War Production Board Report 1944. By autumn 1944, American factories were delivering tanks faster than Japan could destroy them. A Sherman lost to a Japanese ambush in the jungles of Leyte might be replaced in less than 2 weeks by one shipped across the Pacific. For Japanese commanders accustomed to long delays, shortages, and hand-built equipment, this speed bordered on the supernatural. U.S. Army Quartermaster Log 1944. The shock was not limited to Leyte. On Peleliu, where the 1st Marine Division fought a brutal battle against fanatical defenders, Japanese soldiers watched as Shermans burned in coral passes, only to see more land from landing craft the next day. On Guam, garrisons saw tanks that had been knocked out reappear in fresh paint, repaired by mobile workshops the Americans had brought with them. In Japan's War Council's reports grew frantic. The enemy tanks are endless. Imperial Japanese Staff Report, Dec 1944. Numbers tell the story, but the battlefield revealed the truth more viscerally. American armored spearheads simply did not stop. Where one wave faltered, another surged. Japanese commanders, schooled in the Bushido ethic of sacrifice, threw men at the steel tide, but human waves could not halt steel reinforced by production. Each suicide charge was answered by machine gun fire from Shermans, their 50 caliber Brownings scything through bamboo and brush. Marine Corps Combat Report, Sep 1944. The island fighting of 1944 was brutal, intimate, suffocating. In dense jungles, the clash of steel was almost medieval. Sherman tracks grinding over foxholes, flamethrowers clearing bunkers, Japanese soldiers clawing at armor plates with magnetic mines. But every time one tank fell, another appeared. The Japanese began to whisper that the Americans had factories hidden inside their ships, producing new tanks at sea. Dramatized composite. The reality was even more devastating. America's industrial might stretched across a continent. Pittsburgh steel mills, Illinois foundries, Ohio engine plants, California shipyards. Japanese industry, by comparison, was being strangled by blockade and bombing. Resources were dwindling. Oil, steel, rubber, all scarce. Even if Japan could build tanks, they lacked the fuel to train with them, the ships to move them, the planes to protect them. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. By late October, as Sherman columns pushed deeper into Leyte's mountains, Japanese commanders understood a bitter truth. They were not fighting merely an army. They were fighting a factory system that never slept, never ran dry, never stopped. Each destroyed Sherman was not an end, but a signal for another to come. And as the sun set over Leyte, smoke curling from burning palm groves and wrecked Type 95s, one Japanese colonel muttered to his adjutant words that would echo in captured reports. "This is not war. This is a machine that eats war itself," captured Japanese Staff Report Nov 1944. What he did not know was that the American advantage was even deeper than appearances suggested. It was not just about quantity, but the hidden methods, the technical revolutions, the engineers and assembly lines that made the impossible seem routine. And in the next battles, this secret would be revealed in devastating detail. On November 29, 1944, under the grey skies of Leyte, American tank units from the 767th Tank Battalion rumbled forward once again. Their Shermans, mud-splattered but intact, formed steel columns advancing through shattered palm groves and rice paddies. Japanese defenders, exhausted and undersupplied, could hardly believe what they saw. Only weeks before, they had destroyed Shermans in ambushes using 47mm anti-tank guns, satchel charges and suicide squads. Yet here they were again, fresh, gleaming engines roaring, like ghosts of machines that had refused to die. The rumor spread like wildfire among Japanese units. The Americans have found a way to build tanks faster than we can destroy them. Imperial Japanese Staff Memo, Dec. 1944. The truth behind this resurrection lay not on Leyte, but thousands of miles away in the United States. It was the hidden advantage of American war production, the single most decisive factor in the Pacific. The U.S. had mastered the art of industrialized warfare. Unlike Japan, whose tanks were built in small batches at workshops such as the Sagami Arsenal, America had harnessed the full potential of assembly line mass production. The Chrysler-managed Detroit Arsenal tank plant, completed in 1941, was the world's first factory designed solely for the rapid production of armored fighting vehicles. War Department Report 1943. Inside its cavernous halls, the principles pioneered by Henry Ford in the automotive industry were adapted to war. Every worker had a specialized role. Engines from General Motors, transmissions from Spicer, radios from Motorola, all converged on assembly lines. Within days, these components became complete M4 Shermans, ready to ship. Engineers like William Knudsen and Edsel Ford had restructured the American auto industry into a war machine. By 1944, Detroit Arsenal alone was producing over 300 tanks per month, a pace Japan could not hope to match. Technical Manual TM 9731A 1944. Consider the specifications. The standard M4 Sherman weighed about 30 tons, with armor up to 75mm thick and a 75mm M3 gun, capable of firing high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. Later variants carried the more powerful 76mm gun, with muzzle velocity exceeding 2,600 feet per second, enabling penetration of Japanese Chiha and Chinu tanks at ranges beyond 1,000 yards. Shermans were powered by engines like the Continental R975 Radial or the Ford GAA V8, producing up to 500 horsepower and giving speeds of 24 to 26 mph on road. Crucially, they carried radios in every unit, allowing coordination that Japanese tanks, often deployed without reliable radios, could not match. Field Test Report U.S. Ordnance Depth, 1944. For Japan, whose Type 95 Heigo weighed just 7.5 tons with armor only 12 meters thick at its heaviest, the disparity was catastrophic. Its 37mm gun was ineffective against Sherman armor, except at suicidally close range. Even the more modern Type 97 Chiha, upgraded with a 47mm high-velocity gun, struggled to defeat Shermans, except from ambush positions at under 300 meters. In open combat, Shermans annihilated Japanese tanks before they could even close the distance. Japanese Armored Doctrine Summary, U.S. Technical Intelligence 1945. And yet this was not simply about raw numbers or specs. It was about logistics. American engineers built entire floating supply chains. Liberty ships carried tanks by the dozens across the Pacific, while mobile depots and repair battalions followed the front. A Sherman knocked out on Leyte might be dragged back, repaired with spare parts shipped from California, and returned to service within days. Japanese forces, by contrast, lacked both spare parts and fuel. A damaged Chiha often remained abandoned, stripped for metal or left to rust. U.S. Army Ordnance Service Report 1944. This industrial might came to a dramatic head during the Battle of Luzon, January 1945. General Douglas MacArthur's 6th Army launched the largest campaign of the Pacific War since Guadalcanal. Over 175,000 U.S. troops stormed ashore at Lingayen Gulf, supported by 850 ships. Within days, Sherman tanks rolled inland, pressing toward Manila. Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding the Shobu Group, had fewer than 100 operational tanks across Luzon. Most were Chiha or Chihei models. Against hundreds of Shermans they were slaughtered. After-action report 6th Army, Feb 1945. The clash at the village of Urdaneta illustrates the imbalance. On January 14th, elements of the 775th Tank Battalion advanced along the highway, their Shermans fanning out across fields of sugarcane. Japanese Type 97s attempted to set an ambush, their 47mm guns hidden in bamboo groves. At 600 yards they opened fire. One Sherman was struck, its track shattered, smoke pouring from its rear. The Americans returned fire. Within minutes, 4 Japanese tanks were burning, their thin armor punctured with ease. Surviving crews fled into the hills. The Sherman column rolled forward, hardly delayed. 775th Tank Battalion log, Jan 1945. Japanese soldiers described their frustration in captured documents. "Our tanks are no match," one officer wrote. "Even if we destroy one more arrive. Their factories must be gods themselves." Captured Japanese officer diary, Jan 1945. These reports reflected the psychological devastation inflicted by American industry. Where Japanese soldiers expected attrition to grind down their enemy, they instead faced an opponent whose strength increased with every passing month. Behind this advantage stood not just generals, but workers. In cities like Detroit and Cleveland, women welded steel plates under showers of sparks. African-American workers, long excluded from heavy industry, now operated furnaces and presses. Teenagers ran rivet lines, while engineers perfected designs for easier assembly. This was the hidden army, the workers who built victory tank by tank, bolt by bolt. Their contribution never appeared in headlines, but on Luzon and Leyte, their labor turned into advancing steel columns that crushed Japan's defenses. U.S. War Manpower Commission Report 1944. The Japanese High Command recognized the crisis too late. In early 1945, orders were given to accelerate production of the Type 4 Cheeto, a 30-ton medium tank with a 75mm gun. On paper, it might have rivaled the Sherman. In reality, Japan managed to build only a handful of prototypes. By the time they were completed, American B-29 bombers were already reducing Japanese factories to rubble. Post-war U.S. Army Technical Evaluation 1946. Thus, by the time U.S. Shermans entered Manila in February 1945, blasting their way through fortified buildings in the bloodiest urban battle of the Pacific, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The technical edge was decisive. Radios ensured coordination. Engines gave mobility. Armor provided resilience, and mass production guaranteed replacements. Japan could not counter any one of these advantages, let alone all of them combined, and still, the true power of America's tank production was not fully felt until the campaign moved north, toward Okinawa, and finally to the doorstep of Japan itself. By then, Japanese commanders were no longer surprised by the endless Shermans. But what they could not yet grasp was how deeply this industrial storm would shape the endgame, not just on the battlefield, but in the psychology of soldiers and the strategy of nations. Because the machines rolling ashore in 1945 were more than weapons, they were symbols of an unbreakable system. And in the shadows of Tokyo's war councils, officers whispered the unthinkable. The war was no longer about courage or sacrifice. It was about factories, and factories were a war Japan could not win. In the spring of 1945, as the battle for Okinawa raged, Japanese commanders finally confronted the truth that had haunted them since Leyte. On the hills of Shuri and along the rain-soaked ridges of southern Okinawa, the thunder of Sherman tracks grew louder with each passing day. American tanks rolled forward in relentless waves, even as kamikazes struck the fleet offshore and infantry bled in the mud. For every Sherman destroyed in the choking valleys, another appeared, sometimes repaired within hours, sometimes newly landed from the endless convoys offshore. To Japanese eyes, this was no longer a war of armies. It was a war of production, a clash of entire nations' factories and workers. U.S. 10th Army Operations Report, May 1945. Strategically, the effect was overwhelming. The United States not only fielded Shermans in the hundreds across the Pacific Islands, but sustained them with a logistics system unprecedented in human history. By 1945, the U.S. Army had established over 300 depots and maintenance facilities throughout the Pacific, supported by a fleet of cargo ships that delivered tanks, fuel, spare parts, and ammunition with clockwork precision. Japanese units, by contrast, fought with dwindling resources, their supply lines strangled by submarines and B-29 bombers. Many Japanese tanks were immobilized not by enemy fire, but by lack of fuel or spare parts. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Psychologically, the disparity gnawed at Japanese soldiers. Captured diaries revealed an increasing sense of futility. "We fight bravely, but the enemy's steel monsters never stop," wrote one officer after the battle for Manila. "Even when destroyed, they return, as if their spirit is endless." Captured Japanese Officer Diary, March 1945. Allied intelligence officers noted that such reports reflected not just battlefield reality, but the collapse of morale. If one enemy machine could be endlessly replaced, then sacrifice lost its meaning. Bushido, the ethos of death before dishonor, faltered against an opponent who could wage war without apparent limits. The effect reached higher levels of command as well. In interrogations after the war, Japanese staff officers admitted that the pace of American production had been beyond their imagination. One recalled, "We thought America would exhaust itself. Instead, each month their strength grew. It was like fighting an ocean with a sword." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Interrogation, 1946. For the Allies, the psychological impact was the reverse. American soldiers knew that behind them stood the might of Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. A damaged Sherman did not mean despair, but the promise of another waiting just offshore. Troops nicknamed their tanks Ronsons for their tendency to ignite when struck, but they also knew replacements were constant. This confidence emboldened commanders to press harder, take risks, and sustain offensives that would have bled other armies white. U.S. Army Morale Survey, June 1945. The human cost of maintaining this edge was immense, though rarely recognized. In the Detroit arsenal, welders worked in suffocating heat, sparks raining down as steel plates were fused into armored hulls. Women riveters bore calluses on their hands, assembling turrets late into the night. Engineers at General Motors tested engines until their ears rang with the roar of pistons. Maintenance crews in the Pacific stripped wrecked Shermans in open fields, hands black with oil, racing to return them to battle. This hidden labor force, unarmed but relentless, was the silent backbone of victory. War Production Board Report, 1945. By Okinawa, the disparity between American and Japanese armor was so great that tank battles had become massacres. On April 24th, elements of the Japanese 27th Tank Regiment attempted a counterattack near Yonabaru with a dozen Chiha tanks. Within minutes, U.S. Shermans and supporting aircraft annihilated them. Not a single American tank was lost. The wrecks of Japanese armor smoldered in the rain, mute testimony to the futility of facing mass-produced steel with outdated hand-built machines. U.S. 10th Army Action Report, April 1945. The strategic consequences reached beyond the battlefield. America's capacity to replace and expand its armored forces convinced Japanese planners that the war could not be sustained. Even before the atomic bombs fell, Japan's defeat was already written in steel, forged in the furnaces of Detroit and Pittsburgh. The war was lost in the factories, not on the beaches, one Japanese colonel admitted after surrender. Post-war testimony, 1946, and yet, the legacy of this industrial triumph did not end with 1945. The lesson that mass production, logistics, and coordination could outweigh courage and tradition echoed into the Cold War. The U.S. military embraced doctrines of overwhelming force and networked operations, built on the foundation of industry-backed warfare. The Sherman itself, though obsolete by the Korean War, became a symbol of the arsenal of democracy. Its successors, from the M48 Patton to the M1 Abrams, carried the same industrial DNA. Psychologically, too, the war left its mark. Veterans who fought beside Shermans remembered not just the roar of their engines, but the knowledge that their nation could build faster, replace quicker, and endure longer than any foe. For Japanese survivors, the memory was bitter. Their courage had been real, their sacrifices immense, but courage could not weld steel or refine oil. Factories, not swords, had decided the fate of empires. In the Gulf War of 1991, echoes of this truth returned. American M1 Abrams tanks swept across the desert, supported by an industrial complex that dwarfed that of Iraq. Once again, enemies discovered that bravery and numbers could not compensate for logistical and technological superiority. The lesson of 1944-45 lived on. Industry is the true weapon of modern war. Department of Defense Gulf War Report, 1992. And so, the story of America's tanks in the Pacific was more than a tale of machines. It was the story of an idea, that war could be fought as much in the factory as in the foxhole. The Japanese commanders who watched Sherman columns rolling inland from Leyte to Okinawa were witnessing more than enemy armor. They were witnessing the future of warfare. One dramatized composite quote, drawn from fragments of captured reports, captured this realization. We fought with courage. They fought with machines. In the end, courage dies. Machines do not. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower and speed defeats armor. But above all, production, relentless, organized, industrial production, is the force that decides nations' destinies. The American factories of World War II proved it, and in the wreckage of Japanese tanks smoldering across the Pacific Islands, the lesson was carved in steel forever.